There's a way this conversation usually starts. We look at a system getting better, more capable, faster, more reliable, and the instinct is to credit the system itself, to assume the intelligence is improving in a clean, linear way. But when you step back, the pattern doesn't feel quite that simple. The performance gains don't always come from the system becoming more adaptable. A lot of the time, they come from the world around it becoming more structured, more prepared, more aligned with how the system already operates. And that changes how you interpret what you're actually seeing.
What looks like progress is often a combination of two very different things moving together. On one side, you have the system, its underlying capability, how it processes information, how it responds to inputs. That does improve over time, but it tends to improve gradually and within certain boundaries. On the other side, you have the environment, and that's where a much larger share of the visible progress tends to come from. The environment gets shaped, inputs become cleaner, variability is reduced, edge cases are filtered out or anticipated in advance. Entire workflows are redesigned so that the system is operating inside conditions that are easier to manage. So the system doesn't need to become broadly adaptable, it only needs to perform well inside a space that has already been made more predictable. And when both of those forces move together, incremental improvements in the system and significant structuring of the environment, the result can look like a much larger leap than either would produce on its own.
Which makes it easy to misread where the progress is actually coming from. Because if the environment is doing more of the work than we realize, then the performance we're seeing isn't just a reflection of the system's capability. It's a reflection of how much has been done around it to support that capability. And that distinction starts to matter once you move outside those prepared conditions.
The performance holds as long as the structure holds. But as soon as you move into environments that are less controlled, where inputs are less consistent, where conditions change in ways that aren't fully anticipated, the system is no longer operating inside the same assumptions. And that's where the limits begin to show. Not as constant failure, but as sensitivity. Small changes in context can have outsized effects. Situations that fall just outside the prepared range become harder to interpret. The system doesn't collapse, but it loses stability. And that instability is often misunderstood because the system still appears highly capable in most situations. The failures are intermittent, but they're also the moments that carry the most weight.
So the picture that starts to form is less about a system steadily expanding into the world and more about the world being reshaped so that that system can function inside it. And if that's true, then what we're really tracking isn't just capability, it's alignment. Between the system and the environment it depends on.
That alignment becomes the central variable. The more the environment can be structured in advance, the more consistent the system's performance will appear. And the less structured the environment is, the more that performance begins to vary. So the question isn't simply how capable the system is in isolation. It's how much of the surrounding complexity has been reduced, organized, or absorbed before the system ever engages with it. And once you start looking at it that way, the conversation shifts. It becomes less about raw intelligence and more about where that intelligence can actually hold.
Once you start looking at this through the lens of infrastructure, the behavior of the companies closest to it starts to feel different. What's happening right now doesn't really look like gradual expansion. It feels earlier than that, more controlled, more committed. Large amounts of capital are being deployed before the full shape of demand is clear. Buildouts are happening ahead of certainty, and the scale of those decisions suggests something more than just responding to what already exists. It feels like positioning.
That's exactly what it is. In most technology cycles, expansion follows visibility. You wait for usage patterns to stabilize, for demand to become measurable, for growth to be modeled with some confidence, and then you build around that. Here, the sequence is shifting. Infrastructure is being committed before that clarity exists, not because companies have perfect information, but because they're working from a different assumption that these systems will become embedded across workflows, industries, and decision-making itself. And once you start operating from that assumption, the risk changes. It's less about building too early and more about not being ready when it matters. Instead of reacting to growth, they're trying to make sure they're already in position if things accelerate. And that changes how these decisions get made. Infrastructure stops being something you optimize over time. It starts to look more like something you secure early, even if you don't yet know exactly how it will be used. Because if this does become foundational, access to that infrastructure won't just be helpful, it'll be required.
All right, Sophie, let's try and unpack that dynamic a little. Normally, when things are uncertain, companies slow down. They wait for clearer signals. But here it almost feels like uncertainty is pushing them to move faster. Why does it flip like that?
It flips when the system you're dealing with starts to look foundational. In earlier stages, waiting is a reasonable strategy. You can observe, learn, and enter later without giving up much. The downside of being slightly late is manageable. But once a system begins to underpin other systems, once it becomes part of how work gets done, the cost of being late increases in a different way. You're no longer catching up on a feature, you're trying to catch up on infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't compress. It takes time to secure energy, deploy hardware, build facilities, integrate everything into a functioning system. Those timelines don't shrink just because the opportunity becomes clearer. So the decision shifts. It's less about having perfect information and more about avoiding a position you can't recover from.
Right, so if you fall behind at that layer, you're not just behind, you're locked out for a while. It's not like it's something you can fix quickly. So is that essentially what starts to push companies to move earlier than they normally would?
It is. Once someone else has already built capacity, secured power, deployed infrastructure, established presence, that advantage compounds. It's not just that they can operate, it's that they can expand from a position that already works. And for anyone behind them, closing that gap becomes increasingly difficult. So even without perfect clarity, the safer move becomes committing early. Not because you're certain, but because the downside of waiting becomes too large.
Yeah, that makes sense. Once someone gets even a small lead like that, where things are already working and they can start building on top of it, it probably changes how everyone else behaves. It's not just about technology anymore, it's about the positioning. So when multiple companies start moving early like that, it almost feels like they're reacting to each other as much as the technology itself, right? Is that part of what's happening here?
Yes, there's definitely an interaction effect. There is real conviction behind the idea that AI will become deeply integrated. But once a few major players begin committing at scale, it changes the environment for everyone else. Because now you're not just evaluating the technology in isolation, you're evaluating the possibility that your competitors are building something that will define the next phase. And even if you're uncertain, that possibility is hard to ignore. So behavior starts to align, not because everyone sees the future the same way, but because no one wants to be excluded from it.
Got it. So it becomes less about confidence and more about avoiding a position you can't come back from, right? But once that mindset takes hold, how does that actually change what gets built?
It changes both the scale and the timing. Capital starts moving ahead of clarity. Infrastructure gets built earlier, than it normally would. And once that infrastructure exists, it doesn't just sit there passively, it begins to shape what happens next. Because capacity changes behavior. When compute becomes available, it lowers friction, it makes experimentation easier. It allows new workflows to form around what's now accessible. So even if the initial investment is anticipatory, it can accelerate the adoption it was anticipating.
Right. And once that capacity is in place, once the infrastructure actually exists, it starts to change what people can do on a day-to-day basis. It lowers the barrier to trying new things, to experimenting, to building on top of what's already there. So it's not just reacting to where things are going, it's creating the conditions that make that direction more likely. Does that start to turn into a kind of self-reinforcing system?
In some ways, yes. It doesn't guarantee a specific outcome, but it increases the likelihood of one. Because once infrastructure is in place, it creates conditions where usage becomes easier, more economical, and more attractive. And as usage grows, it justifies more infrastructure. So you get a feedback loop. Build-out supports adoption, adoption supports further build-out, and over time, that loop becomes harder to break.
Yeah, but that also sounds like where the risk sits. If you're building ahead of demand and that demand doesn't materialize the way that you expect, you're left carrying something pretty heavy. So how do companies think about that side of it?
That's exactly where the tension is. These systems are expensive to build and expensive to operate. They require ongoing energy, maintenance, coordination. So if demand arrives slower than expected or doesn't scale in the way you projected, that capacity can sit underutilized. And underutilization at this scale is not trivial. It affects margins, it affects returns, it affects how sustainable that investment is over time. So timing becomes critical. Not just whether the system works, but whether everything lines up when it needs to.
Right, because even if the direction is correct, and even if everything eventually plays out, there's still this dependency on when it happens. All of the pieces have to come together at the right time for the system to actually hold. So it's not just a bet on direction, it's a bet on timing. And on those timelines lining up closely enough for everything to work out.
And the scale of that build-out matters, because this isn't infrastructure being added gradually in response to steady growth. It's being developed in anticipation of what the system might require, which means each decision carries more uncertainty. You're not just responding to what exists today. You're positioning for what could become essential. So once that level of capital is committed, it doesn't just support the system, it starts to shape it. Infrastructure doesn't just enable activity, it influences it. It changes what's feasible, it changes what gets built, it changes how quickly systems evolve. The build-out becomes part of the mechanism driving the system forward, which makes the question a little different. It's not just whether AI becomes embedded across the economy, it's whether this level of commitment makes that outcome more likely. As more infrastructure comes online, expectations rise alongside it. And once those expectations are in place, it becomes harder to step back.
What's interesting about all of this is how different it feels from the usual story we tell about technology. On the surface, it still looks familiar. New models, new tools, capabilities improving quickly, but underneath, what's taking shape feels heavier than that. It feels like a build-out that's happening ahead of full clarity, driven as much by positioning as by demand.
Adoption has to expand. Demand has to fill the capacity. Infrastructure has to come online in time to support it. And those timelines don't always move together. When they drift apart, you start to see friction. So what you're watching isn't just growth, it's a series of interdependent bets, all trying to land within a certain window. And once enough of those bets are in motion, the system itself starts to assume they'll work. So the question shifts again, not just whether this expands, but where it actually can.
And that's where the tension starts to build. Even if the capital is there, even if the infrastructure is being built, that doesn't necessarily mean that it can be deployed wherever it's needed.
No, and that's where the next constraint begins to show, because this system doesn't just depend on being built, it depends on where it can actually exist.
High-interest debt can feel like a trap. With Volo, you can break free. Just choose how much you need. Set the terms that work for you. Share your story. And send the request to people you trust. Your network sees it instantly, and you're on your way. Borrow with confidence at fair rates. From